Well, hi, it's Steve Maxwell here. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you everything I've learned so far about choosing a fabric structure. And by fabric structure, I mean something that's got a metal framework and it's covered in fabric. And I don't mean the small things you might buy from a hardware store to park your car in. What I'm talking about are larger structures. They're under tension from the fabric, so they're typically engineered and fairly large. The one I'm putting up here at my property on Manitoulin Island, Canada, is 42 feet wide and 80 feet long. You might need something smaller, you might need something bigger, but that's generally the scale that I'm talking about here. And I want to cover 5 main questions to ask yourself and answer. And these would be the length and width you might need. That's pretty obvious, but it's easy to make a mistake and generally undersize your shelter. The brand and design that makes sense. And by design, I mean mostly the shape of it. What type of foundation are you going to put under this structure? Because you can't just put them directly on the ground. They're large, as I said. And how will you get the structure raised? Because these are large enough that nobody can do them by hand. There's certain machinery that's involved, and that also begs the question of whether you put it up yourself or whether you get a contractor to do it for you. And finally, the 5th point is, what will you do with the interior space? And I'm going to be giving you some examples of different things to do. Minimalist on one side and some pretty impressive examples on the other too. So let's get started with what size is right. I really recommend not just guessing. And that's the easiest thing to do. You say, well, I need one, 30 by 50 or whatever. In my experience, though, people tend to underestimate the amount of storage space they need. And that's why I recommend starting with a scale drawing of some kind, just on paper, just some doodling. I could put my compact tractor here. I could put my boat over there. I could put our four-wheelers over here, that kind of thing. But don't just stop there, because the next step I recommend is doing some sort of a mock-up on the ground. So maybe choose a spot somewhere out of the way, maybe in the location where you want to put the shelter, and mark it out some way, nothing fancy, some strings in the ground or something like that, and then try moving the equipment in there. This could take you half a day or so, but it's time well spent, in my experience, because it's going to give you a sense of how much space you really need. And once again, it's not just storage space you're looking for, but it's also access space. You have to be able to get to the stuff and get it in and out without too much hassle. So when you've got everything figured out, really should add 20% or so, because it's very easy to undersize any kind of a shelter. Now, there's something I've learned from a smaller shelter that I've had here at my place for quite a while. It's only 16 by 30, so it doesn't really qualify into the category I'm talking about now. But I did order it with doors at both ends. And I don't just mean a door a person can walk through. I mean a door big enough to bring things in and out of. And that's enormously helpful, because it means you don't have to preserve continuous access to the things at the back so that you can get them out the front, because there really is no back and front when you can open up both ends. You can also get a lot of very nice ventilation through a building like that when both ends can be open. So just a little thing, but I consider it to be pretty valuable. One other thing to keep in mind too, with these fabric structures, the widths are generally offered incrementally. So, 25 feet, 30 feet, 35, 40 feet. Those are kind of set frame widths that different manufacturers will use. But there really is no limit to the length, because you can just keep adding more frames and making a longer cover. So this photo up here now is kind of interesting. This is probably the biggest fabric structure I've ever seen. I don't know how wide it is. Just eyeballing it, I'm thinking 50 feet maybe wide. But the thing is 612 feet long. And as I said, that's just a matter of adding more frames. So not very likely that you're going to want to have a shelter this long, but it's just important to understand how it's sized, that the widths are standard in increments, and the length is pretty much just whatever you want. So now another thing too, when I was first considering my shelter, I thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice to put some heat in there in the wintertime? Because in my case, I'm going to be using it for equipment storage and equipment repair, mostly. So yeah, sure, you can put insulation blankets on the inside. It's done all the time, but there's a big drawback, and it's what prompted me not to go this route, and that's because you don't get any more of the natural sunlight through the cover. Most covers are white, and when the sun is shining on them, you get a beautiful diffuse light inside. And in fact, that sunlight can warm things up considerably, even in the wintertime, too. It's kind of like a greenhouse effect in a way, but you lose all that with the insulation blankets. So you lose the lighting and the nice ambiance that you can get in there. You'll see some photos later about what I mean and how nice it can look inside. But know that insulation is possible, but there is a bit of a drawback to it too. So, second point, what brand and design? Well, these are serious structures, and the top companies engineer them, which means that they don't just have sort of on-the-shelf designs, one size fits all for a given size of shelter. They actually take into consideration the snow loads where you are, wind loading, foundation type, things like that. So that's one thing I looked for in a company. I wanted a company that took the engineering seriously, because if you think about it, you're really trusting that structure to do a lot for you when you've got equipment and tools and maybe animals inside. You do not want a failure under any circumstances. So another question to ask is how long the company's been in business. Companies come and go in this field. It's really been kind of popular over the last 30 plus years. That's when they really started to come on. I remember when I first started seeing these fabric structures. So you want to look for longevity. Local service. Maybe there's a branch falls on your cover and rips it. Is there someone to come out and do a kind of a proper welded repair on that? You're not going to need a lot of service, but sometimes you might want to appeal to someone to help you out, and so that's another consideration. Here's something too. It's one thing to have a manufacturer that you trust, but if you're going to have that structure put up by someone else, it probably won't be the manufacturer directly. It will probably be one of their dealer/installers. So you'll want to check that out too. What's the reputation of the company that's going to come around and do the work if you're not going to do it yourself, because that's important too. You can have a great product, but you want to make sure you have a great dealer and installer too. So all these things considered, I went with a company called Calhoun. They've been at the ground floor of fabric structure design and construction for more than 30 years. I've seen their structures around the countryside because they got their little name on the top, so you know who made it. And I've seen them hold up very large structures, never any issues. They struck me initially as a first-class operation, and as I worked with them, coming up with a design for my own structure, I continued to be impressed. One of the first people I dealt with was a man named Dan Dalzell, and he's the director of sales and operations, and he was very helpful in helping me work through some of the things I'm going to talk to you about here. In particular, the shape of the building and the foundation that's chosen. Now, when we got into the nuts and bolts of actually designing and engineering my structure, I was talking with a man named Alan Ball. He's the engineering manager at Calhoun, and he was very helpful in terms of answering my questions, making suggestions, pointing me in the right direction to people who've had experience with structures like I have. I had some questions for them, how things worked out. So all in all, I'm very pleased. And that's the homepage of their website. Now, they provided me with some very complete engineered drawings. And the first use for this sort of thing is in getting your permit, because most places, most jurisdictions require some kind of a permit to put up a structure like this. But it's a very easy process when you have engineered drawings like this. That comes as part of the package. So this is the cover of the thing. It's about a dozen pages long or so. I'm not going to go through everything, but a lot of details here. This chart is interesting because these fabric structure companies don't generally engineer the foundation. And in my case, as you'll see, it's kind of an unusual foundation because it's an unusual situation where I'm putting this structure. So I turned this chart over to an engineer, a friend of mine, and he generated the engineered drawings I needed in order to build that foundation properly. So you got that information here. This is a top view of the structure that you can see, and the details in the middle are measured drawings for all of, in my case, the ends of the steel legs as they will bolt to the concrete foundation that I have, and also to the other components further up on the structure. So measured drawings, very helpful. That has been. Some more drawings here showing where the internal bracing goes once that the frames go up. An end view here. In my case, if you look in the middle, you'll see I've specified a 14-foot wide, 14-foot tall door. And I have one of those at each end, like I said. I'm going to be working in a person-sized door to one side of each of these big doors. And that's something that will come later. It's not really part of the engineered design for reasons that I will explain later. More details about all the fittings and how they go together. I am going to be putting up the structure myself, and I'm going to be covering more about that, producing videos and different things. But these details in the drawing package have been very helpful. Now, believe it or not, I mean, this thing, 42 feet by 80 feet long, that's a pretty big structure, but it arrived on the trailer that you see here, being pulled by a pickup truck. So that's one of the nice things about these structures, is that they don't actually take up a lot of materials, which means, in my case, we unloaded, this is the trailer from Calhoun, we unloaded it here because he couldn't get where we were going, because it's kind of a bit of an isolated situation where the actual structure site is, and you'll see more about that later. But I was surprised at how small and compact the whole package was. All of the metal parts there are hot-dipped galvanized, very heavy zinc coating. They're never going to corrode, even though they're covered in fabric, of course. But even if they stood out in the weather, they could probably be there for 100 years or more and not change one bit. So very impressed with quality so far. Now, getting down to the nuts and bolts, what kind of a foundation will you put under this thing? There are different options, and the 5 that I've mentioned here are not the only options, but they are probably the most popular. And I guess the most popular of the choices is wood posts set in soil. That's what I would be using at my place, except I didn't want to put this thing up where I have soil. Here on Manitoulin, there is some good farmland, but there's also bedrock, exposed limestone bedrock. So I didn't want to use up any of my good land for this shelter when I've got 40 acres of something like bald rock surrounding my fields. So that's where I'm putting it. So I couldn't be sinking wood posts into limestone bedrock, but that is a common approach. It's economical, strong, simple, and doesn't even really need to be engineered because it's such a simple approach. They know what size of posts you need for a given structure, stuff like that. Precast concrete foundation blocks. These are those big, heavy things that they move in place with an excavator, and they're heavy enough that when they're parked side by side, you can anchor a fabric structure to them, and that will be sufficiently strong. So a very simple option. It's going to cost more than the wood posts, of course, but no real engineering required there. Sea containers. Yeah, believe it or not, you can use sea containers as a foundation for these things. More on that in a minute. Helical anchors. So these are like corkscrews that go into the soil and provide a kind of a footing for each of the posts that are part of the frames. But once again, you need lots of soil for that. And then the option that I used is poured concrete wall with steel legs bolted to the top of it. So let's just take a look at each of these types now. This is the wood post foundation. As I said, pretty simple. Some people put up a shelter like this and just leave it that way. If you're just storing, farm equipment or something like that, and you don't need an enclosed shop space or anything, then I've seen plenty of structures where they just stop right here, and it works fine. It serves the purpose. This caught my eye when I was first starting my journey and figuring out what kind of a shelter I wanted. And, as you see on either side here, these are shipping containers. These are the kinds of things that they load onto ocean-going freighters and move stuff all over the globe. So I thought, wow, gee, that seems like an interesting idea. You've got secure space on either side. You can make use of the roof of these things, which, of course, is inside now, for storage. And then you've got the space in the middle, too. So it all seemed fine and dandy. But then I talked to Dan Dalzell about this, and he said, yeah, it can work, but the challenge is the sea containers on their own are not sufficiently strong to take the pressures that is going to be put on them, say in a windstorm or heavy snow load situation. So the steel sea containers need to be reinforced with more steel. That didn't seem like a lot of fun to me, and when I was figuring all this out, the price of sea containers shot through the roof. So I've got other ideas now, but that is an option that some people use. Here's a close-up of my situation. So that's limestone bedrock. There used to be forest here, maybe a couple of inches of soil. So I cut and chipped all of the trees and had the site scraped. And then I also pressure washed where the foundation wall is going to go. And that's why you see the dark area to the right there and the lighter stone underneath. This is actually a concrete form I'm building. But because I'm building it on bedrock, and the bedrock is pretty flat, but it does taper, as you can see, regular forming techniques are kind of challenging because it's difficult to get plywood or rigid concrete forms to conform to a bedrock shape. So I'm building a form frame and then putting fabric, a special concrete containment fabric on the inside. Now, what you're seeing here is the outside wall of the form with the fabric installed, and then there's fiberglass rebar, which is epoxied down into the rock. Because that's part of the engineered specs that I got from my friend about what sort of a foundation we needed here. There remains to be erected the frame forming the inside of the forms, but I wanted to get most of the fabric work done before that. So you'll see on the far side of the forms there's some steel rebar that's going down into the rock that supports the form on the outside, and then there's also some rebar similarly pounded into the rock on the inside. That's going to be supporting the inner frame. So an unusual situation, but I think it's pretty well ideal for the circumstances that I have. This is an aerial view of what you just saw, with the form not poured with concrete yet. But that's my situation, and that's why we had to bring in the materials on farm wagons instead of that pickup truck trailer rig that you saw earlier. So, the big question, how will the structure get raised? That's one thing to build a foundation. That's pretty simple, but if you're dealing with a structure that's, say, 30, 40, 50 feet wide, the peak of that could be 30 or 40 or even 50 feet high by the time you get to the top of the curve of the hoop or whatever shape your structure has. So that means you're going to need some equipment to raise that, a sky jack or lifts or something like that. So that's really what you need to ask yourself right up front. Am I comfortable renting and using equipment like this? With some help, of course. You won't be able to do it by yourself. You'll need 3 or 4 competent helpers as well as that machine, I would think. So are you up to that? Are you up to learning how to do that? That's the question. And if the answer to that question is no, well, then you'll want to get a contractor to help you do that. In my case, the answer is yes. I've never done this before, but I think I can handle it. I'm going to give it a try. And so my project is owner-led, let's say. And just to give you a glimpse, this is a pretty big shelter. This is probably far bigger than anything you might consider putting up. But it does give you a sense that, you're going to need machines. These things, the frames are sort of partially assembled on the ground and raised in place, and they also have to be braced until you get enough frames in place that it becomes self-supporting. So that's another trick. You will find some stuff online. I've got a connection with a contractor who does this sort of thing all the time. I'll be peppering him with questions when the time comes. So, but that's really what you need to decide. Can you handle it on your own or not? Now, this is the fun part, I think, and this is deciding what you're going to do with the interior space. As I mentioned before, you can just leave it plain. A lot of people do that. You can optimize the interior for basic storage. You can also configure it for livestock housing. Makes a great livestock barn. And even optimize the space for public events. Because, as I said, the interior ambiance of these structures is quite attractive, actually. Nice and light and airy. And, well, let's just take a look at some of the things. So, plain storage, hay storage, a great option for handling hay, especially nowadays when so much hay is put up in big, fat, heavy, bulk round bales that weigh 800 pounds each or something like that. So they can be loaded in. There's no issue with the floor being strong enough or anything like that as you'd have in a regular barn. This is also pretty open. This is an equestrian arena. Not much beyond just the regular structure, but it has been dolled up a little bit. There's wood on the inside, and just to make it look a little nicer, and sand on the floor that will be smoothed from time to time with a tractor and harrow, but still pretty basic. This is kind of a neat thing. I've never met the man who put this up, but that's his workshop inside. Nice big workshop. But he's extended the roof structure to provide a kind of front porch to sit on, which is a great thing. Front porches are great. I love them on houses. I love them on anything. And so there's a bit of an innovative use for the porch concept. Isn't this a great little barn? Once again, light and airy. No need for artificial lighting during the day. And, breezy. You can open up both ends completely. It's a wonderful environment for livestock. And buildings like these are used for even much bigger operations than this. Not too far from where I am, there's a dairy barn, dairy cattle. And they live and get milked in situations like this. So that's one of the more extravagant interior finishing approaches, I think. But take a look at this. Isn't that lovely? This is a wedding reception public gathering space. And you've got all the beauty of natural light with none of the risks of a thunderstorm, essentially. The bottom is open, so there's lots of air coming in there. I don't know whether that can be closed or not if it gets really windy, but the point here is these things can be very beautiful and not just for storing your tractor or your goats either. Anyway, just to sum up, so how big you're going to make the thing, what brand and design, what foundation type, how are you going to get the thing raised, and what will you do with the interior space. So anyway, if you got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Email me at steve@stevemaxwell.ca. Thanks for watching.